Now I got to think of ways of how to introduce this. Hmm. Okay, so I guess we'll just call this episode 1 then.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so, welcome everybody to what would be episode 1 of whatever this podcast should be titled. Um, and my first person to have interviewed and tortured and questioned and what have you is going to be somebody I've shared quite a long history musically with. One of the first guitarists I've ever worked with, Francisco Garcia.
Hello, hello.
And
It's great to
so,
be here.
today, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss 3 albums of which he provided me, because one wasn't enough. One wasn't enough. I asked for his favorite, but he gave me 3, and we'll roll with it. We'll see what happens, what comes of it. And so we'll start off with this first one here. Japanese Breakfast is the group name, and it's Soft Sounds from Another Planet is the title of
Right.
the album there. So I'll go off by starting with the
Yeah, I
question of
actually want to
like,
know your thoughts first.
oh,
Your
okay. So we're gonna start with
yeah,
thoughts first. Okay.
your
Um,
thoughts.
Overall, what this album gave to me was a lot of like mental imagery. Like immediately, it gave me a lot of like, oh, I can definitely see myself listening to this like on a road trip or like in a certain setting. Like it just gave me a picture in my mind like immediately from the first like 2 tracks.
Right.
Um, so there was something about the way they layered instruments in and they layered the parts in. It was just something that's like kind of in the background for me. And so as I went through, it developed quite a bit
Interesting.
more as far
Mhm.
as like what that setting would be. But immediately, the first few tracks, I was just like, I could imagine listening to this in my car on the way to wherever. I can just see like the sky kind of passing by. Um, and
Okay.
that was just like at face value, like first listen is what I got.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, I have the album on vinyl. Like this is like
There we go.
truly one
Less
of my
editing I have
favorite
to do.
albums of all time. Um and recently I um I got back into it because I don't know. Something reminded me of it, and I would say around like I want to say towards the end of 2021, I really got back into her music in general, um, but particularly that album. And just to be clear, Japanese Breakfast is a band, but it's more so like one of those bands where it's like they have an artist and then the band that supports that artist kind of thing.
Okay, gotcha. I wasn't too
And
sure, but yeah, thank you for
yeah, and it's the woman
clarifying.
on the cover. Her name is Michelle Zauner. Um, yeah, and it's really interesting that you point that out. That like it's like a passive listen. You said that was the first time around. So did you listen to it multiple times?
Yeah, I felt like one listen wasn't enough, especially with having 3 albums at hand. So this
I
first
agree.
one, there was like knowing you and the way you kind of perceive music, it's not just the surface of what's there. So I felt one
Right,
listen wasn't enough to get everything out of that. And so by
for sure.
my second and third listens, that's kind of all I had time to really delve into. But my second and third listens, I started to like really kind of understand emotions and more of like colors and stuff they were trying to portray with
Yeah,
the either the groupings of whatever chords and stuff or their progressions, what have you. There's a couple different things that were mood shifts or anything like that. That's what I really latched onto as I started to listen to it.
right.
And so for you, what was it that really stuck out to you in this album?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, it's lagging.
Oh, no worries. So with this album, what do you think stuck out to you? What was really interesting, and why did you give this to me as an album to listen to? What was it that gave you that idea?
Well, I mean, the reason why I gave you all these albums was because I wanted to challenge you. Really, um, like this one and another one, the Mexican one. That those two are probably like the easiest to listen to. But then, obviously, it's Slint. Spiderland was the hardest, but I just wanted to challenge you really. And also these are albums that challenged me as well. Um, with this one being like in order of like most challenging, I would say the Mexican was the easiest to digest, and then it was this one, and then the hardest being that one. In
Oh,
terms of
okay.
the albums that I gave you, of like easy to process and digest and stuff, but even for me it was kind of difficult to process. And actually when I first got into it, um, a friend had recommended it to me in high school. This was like back in 2017. Ben actually.
Okay, yeah.
This is like the one of the biggest like recommendations of my life. It's like, you know, when people say, "Oh, you put me on," like this is like, I'm like, dude, I don't know if anyone's has competed with like, dude, you really put me on like to this like level. Like
Okay.
mostly like other artists, like I've kind of tend to find myself the ones that really spoke to me. But at first, I didn't see it as much other than like some indie rock art female artist solo project, but I thought at the time was a solo project. Um, and I just listened to like one or two songs that I really liked. But when I came back to it, or actually as time passed, I remembered those songs much more fondly. And when I got back into it at the end of 2021, I that's when when it really hooked me, and I'm like, Jesus, like how did I like skip over this? How did I like, I guess I was in a different place or a different time, but I guess what really stood out to me when I went back to it was just like how much of me is in it. Um at least sonically, um and the some of the themes that are talked about, and particularly the way she experiences or she chooses to express her grief and her sadness, really connected with me. And it's no wonder that even when I was like young in high school listening to that album, I I connected to it on some level, even if it wasn't immediately, because I was at the time going through something. Um, but yeah, I mean, to sort of pony off of that, especially like the sound in particular, was this whole album was something that like a lot of these songs were things that to me always seemed obviously like they existed somewhere in the world, but I just didn't know where they were.
Okay.
Like sometimes you have like a sound of an album or a sound of a song in your head where you're like, that's should obviously exist, but then you realize it's like maybe it's not as obvious as you may think. So it was like something, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I understand. It's more of like an idea that's been made, but it's not really been categorized, or at least you think it hasn't as of yet. Like it doesn't.
It's more like I
Go ahead.
thought of, you know, when you hear like a really strong idea and you're like, that has to be taken. Like someone has to have done it already,
Yeah.
but they hadn't.
Right. So like
That's
it
what
would
it's
have
like.
its place in the world as far as like, oh, this has been like you're saying, it's been done before. This
Hmm.
sound, this, composition, something to this effect has already been made. But this would be your first interaction or iteration, what have you, of this type of, I guess, sonic space, for lack of a better term. Um,
Right.
so like
But this specifically.
right. So, like you were saying, you had that indie pop rock kind of thing on your initial listen back in high school when you were first introduced to it, right?
Yeah.
So now that you have fresher ears, or back when you kind of latch back onto it, is you had a totally different idea as to what this kind of enveloped, what was, you know, experienced through the album, the whole emotions, the different waves of stuff, all of that kind of developed as you listen to it again and again.
Yeah. Um yeah, definitely. I mean, even today while I was listening to it again, I noticed things that I didn't notice. Um and I found new ways to appreciate it. I don't know, it's like I know on some way it's pretty simple, but I think in other ways it has a lot of depth to it that I can't really quite explain unless it just makes sense. It's one of those things. Like
Yeah.
and I think music has that particular quality to it, especially because of how abstract it is. Um, I guess what were your favorite moments for the album? Like, what favorite songs, favorite moments? You know, could you understand the lyrics? You know?
Well, I will be honest. I haven't listened to it enough times to really kind of look and see into that realm of stuff. So, from a listening standpoint, what I guess internalized most was the musicianship, like the mood that the instruments were conveying and the transitions. So,
Mm-hmm.
for me, there was like a very bright softness through the beginning of the album, and then as things progressed I listened a little bit closer, and then I start to, like you were saying, her what's the way I could put this, there's a certain emotionality that comes over through the songs that if you're just listening to them you're not going to catch. There's, like you
Yeah,
were saying, there's a depth to it now. So
if you're a passive listener, yeah.
right, so if you pay attention to the stuff as the songs go on, you kind of understand there's a bit of a theme developing, even though it may not be like per se a concept album. All the songs are kind of
Mm-hmm.
connected in a way that it tells a story. So for
Yeah.
me, I didn't come to any realization of that until like Here Come the Tubular Bells.
Oh, so the last track.
Right, exactly. So I listened to the entire thing, and then I heard the bells that actually came at that final track. And then I don't know if it was like a trigger for me, but it made me kind of like regress and like think about all of what I just listened to again. And then it
Yeah.
kind of started to make sense, or like rather, I was starting to internalize some of the lyrics, some of the moods and stuff they were, putting out there.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, I internalized a lot of the musicianship and a lot of the instruments, not necessarily most of the lyrics, at least
Yeah.
as of
Yeah.
yet. But I do want to touch back on, like you were saying, from a sonic standpoint with you involved. I listened to this album and I heard you throughout almost every single song. Like
Yeah.
if I thought about what parts would go on this album, I envisioned you playing through all the guitar parts, all of them.
Oh yeah.
So it was like you 100%, and everything I've ever like experienced as far as working with you musically, it made entire sense as to why you gave me this album.
Yeah.
And so I was like, wow, okay, most of his sound came from this. A lot of your guitar licks, a lot of your in general your tone comes a lot from this as well, or at least in my opinion, I've
Yeah.
heard a lot of that in you.
I mean, definitely tone wise. Um, and I will say, like, I'm at very much at the start of my music career, and so I'm just getting like a foothold into starting to develop some voice on like in music, but I feel like right now I'm in my adolescent phase of that, and so as a result, I'm kind of doing that thing where I inadvertently copy what I just really love. Um,
I mean, that's
you know what I
influence, isn't
mean?
it?
Yeah, exactly. But I definitely do want to eventually develop that into something a lot more, hopefully original and more unique. But definitely, like, yeah, this album has, and even like I can show an example, like
Yeah.
stuff like I also have the Big Sky, which I've seen her and her band use a lot, and it's like a high end reverb pedal um, that you can hear on like a bunch of records. But I mean, and you'll hear how like it works, especially in the context of the album. You'll hear like or something like that, or even something like this, like. Uh,
Yeah, just like the opening track. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, honestly, like even when I'm messing around with my pedals, like I can very obviously hear, like, yeah, this pedal was like used a lot in terms of like some of the sounds that were used. Um, but yeah, like especially like to add on to like apart from just tone, I really like um melancholic like licks and phrases and just melancholic songwriting. Because for me, that was such a huge identity um, when it came to how I related to music. Um, was just how I process my sadness or my grief and the things that I was dealing and struggling with. And I think with this and other albums that are similar in terms of like these big sounds is like, especially when you're young, it's really hard to make sense of like what you're feeling, and the world is really confusing. And even now the world is really confusing, but I've understood myself a lot more. um but back then things really didn't make sense. And so like to feel that, to hear that sort of sadness portrayed in a way that's like this big open sound, that it's like it could be anything, it's very abstract and ambiguous, it's like yes, that's exactly what that sounds like those feelings are exactly what that sounds like
Yeah.
those sounds are what that feels like rather. um and Yeah, and I particularly like that sometimes that can tend to turn into like just really, how do you say, open-ended, not conclusive like songwriting. But with her it's very poignant, and it ends and has conclusions. And I love her ability to combine these shoegaze tones and these very vast and open sounds with traditional songwriting. And I will also point to a band called Savlaki who did that. um, was that, no, it's Slow Dive. Their album Slovaki. But yeah, yeah,
So, I mean,
agree.
there was something on that I wanted to touch on again. But like I said earlier, the emotionality that the sounds they're able to like produce,
Yeah,
these sounds that you heard or experienced, you were able to then kind of link that, or rather group that with a certain emotion that either you kind of weren't entirely sure what it was, or you weren't like aware of whatever this feeling was, or like it basically made a soundtrack for that, lack of a better word, event, or that emotion you had.
kind of. Yeah, kind
Yes.
of. Yeah.
I kind of relate to that in a there's a bunch of different albums that like I categorize it as like the soundtrack of my life. Is there certain
Hmm.
albums that are able to portray emotions I've had or thoughts I've had clearer than I could actually, I guess, replicate or even explain.
Yeah.
And music tends to be that vehicle that you can't explain what it is. You can just say this is what it is, and your understanding of that is like absolute. You'd
Oh
rather
yeah.
just live with this being that category of thing as opposed to trying to explain it to somebody,
Yeah.
because the sounds that bands are able to produce, much like this here, they're able to make sounds that people can latch onto with something that they necessarily can't explain otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's
They're
a
soft sounds from another planet.
exactly. It's a. I mean, it's fairly. It's magical at times when you like, you feel that like it's immediate when you hear it. You just like you don't even think about the link between the two things, the music and the emotion. It just kind of immediately fills in that spot.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, oh, okay, well, now I have that to remember or that to go back to if I ever listen to this. It's just, it's always there. It's that library of emotions that you can just basically,
Just makes sense.
yeah, you hit the track, and if you want to feel that, you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually want to like go through each track, because I'd be very interested to get your opinions on each of them. But I will say um that it's really interesting when I to listen to this album, because I know a lot of context about it, a lot of context.
Mm.
Um, Essentially, when she was writing this album, she had just signed to Dead Oceans, her record label, and so she was kind of worried about it while she was writing. She had never felt the pressure to actually, write an album for a record label and stuff, and it had originally started off as this sort of sci-fi esque album, concept album bordering on sci-fi esque album like that. But it eventually turned into something where she talked more about her grief and became a lot more personal. And you can definitely see that if you go through like the track listings. Like it starts off with Diving Woman, a song that's very like it sounds like you're in space. Like it sounds like one of those like it's really really cool. And hearing the arrangement is like you can get lost in it, but I kind of like to really focus in on it and just pick apart like every instrument that's coming into the this the soundscape, so to speak. And I think it's a great start off to the album. It's very fun. But what did you think about Diving Woman?
Well, much like you were saying, it opened up a. It was something very, very simple to get into. It wasn't just hit the ground running, and then everything was obscure from there, or everything was kind of like involved in thought. It was more of just something where they painted a very, very large background for people to kind of latch onto and be like, okay, I can get into this. Just
Yeah,
something, just like the hook of like the first line of a book. You're not going to get a lot of people reading it if that first line doesn't get you interested, or something that's relatable, something that you can just be like, okay, I could roll with this.
right. This is like very much it sounded like the shuttle, so to speak.
Yeah, actually, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, everybody gets on the shuttle there, and okay, we're gonna see where this takes us, type of
The
deal.
rocket.
And
Yeah.
like you were saying with the sci-fi or the space-esque type of thing, that's exactly what those the guitar lines kind of put me in. That's why I said like road trip type of deal, because like I just thought of like the vast, like the empty sky just passing, as like say you're a passenger on a road trip, you're just looking like out the window,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, yeah.
that played in the background of my mind as that like imagery went through.
Yeah. I think it's just a very fun track. It's produced very well. I mean, the whole album is produced very well,
Yes, it
but
is.
that just kind of hits you like immediately, like here we are, kind of thing. And it's yeah, it's great. But yeah, you were saying something about the road trip, and I think that actually transitions us into the next song, Roadhead.
Yes. I actually want you to kind of explain this one to me a little bit. Like,
Okay.
I want you to kind of tie me into what's going on with this song.
So it's actually it's similar in terms of like that sort of driving kind of sound and like keeping like one sort of harmony going on in the background, but keeping things interesting with different sounds as opposed to progressions and melodies. Um, so there's that, and also, but the song is kind of it's weird because the music video is like her sort of being partners with this monster thing. Um, and the song is like I don't know how to explain it. It's like, and let me get the lyrics because I need to make sure I'm not gonna like you know say something wrong. Which is cool. I have them right here. Yeah, I mean it's just like another story about just kind of going towards somewhere, but with a partner in this case. Um, with a line obviously opening up, "You gave a roadhead on a turnpike exit." Um,
Yeah.
but I really appreciated in Roadhead specifically like the use of like electronics and stuff like that. Which if you listen to like any of the previous stuff like that she had worked on, it's kind of like a bit of a jump, and it actually touches into like another aspect that I really liked about the album that you can hear influences of like video game soundtracks. And
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. That
and
makes a
I think
lot of sense.
she does like a really good job of incorporating that into like an interesting sort of song as a song interesting songwriting tool. And I know that like this song was a single actually to promote the album, and people really like this one. This is like even before the album release, like this is one that people really really enjoyed. I think it might be actually the most played on Spotify from the album. Um, I think it's that one. Let me check. exactly. Oh no, oh yeah, it is. From that album, yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
Which is interesting. But yeah, I think it showcases, and again, also the production. I really like the use of those electronic drums um
They
on
sit
on
well in the
that.
mix. Like it's
Yeah.
not an album that necessarily needs to have an acoustic vibe to it. It's more something that's okay, this is a focused, like you were saying, electronic heavy type of deal where it's
Yeah.
more involved with the experiment of what kind of sounds can we get, whereas the drums are more of just the driving factor of they fit really nice on a low end.
Yeah.
So like you get enough drive from the kick and the snare and everything's simple's not the word, but it's definitely something that fits the job of what the drums are supposed to do on this album. They're not overplayed,
Yeah.
they're not overdone. They're very much like I think perfectly written for the rest of the sounds of the album to kind of showcase.
Yeah.
And like you were saying with all the electronics involved, it really gave, as I mentioned, more stereo, I guess, area for the stuff to kind of like, oh, let's try something with the guitars here, or let's try an effect loop here, or let's add
Yeah.
something from keys in here, and it gave the space for everything else to shine.
Yeah. I mean, personally, like one of my favorite things about that song was the sort of like little. It was like a panning effect. It sounded like a harp, but it was a synthesizer. Like it was really that's really cool, and I really like that. Um, but interesting, you said it's an electronic album because I don't really see it as an electronic album per se. I see these first two songs, actually three, first three songs mostly as being the most electronically dense, and the others, though they obviously have synths involved, they don't really sound like an electronic song, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, and I think the last thing I want to say about this song is just that the use of her, like the samples of her voice, was really a really nice touch. Like, I just really love the way everything's produced. Also, Craig Hendricks is her producer. He's also the drummer of the band.
Oh, no kidding.
Um, and I've always been curious as to how much he actually contributes to the band and how much, just how much each person is responsible for, because holy crap, this album sounds great. And a lot of songs I cannot imagine without certain parts being put in there or being produced the way that they are. Um, they're
Yeah,
so integral to the songwriting.
right. That's
But
what gives it that vibe. Each song obviously has its own identity, but like
yeah,
the album as a cohesive unit, it definitely has its own sonic sound or ability rather.
yeah,
Um, so there's that on the end of Roadhead, and then are we
yeah,
moving along to the next one or
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Like I obviously know Boyish because that was one that prior to me even knowing about this album is something that you showed me.
I played it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I sang it.
So you did your rendition of that, and I remember thinking, "Is like, is he really singing the parts, or like, is he really pitchy?" And then I go back to listen to the
Mhm.
album, and I was like, "Oh no, he did a fantastic job of doing this. Like he hit the notes
Yeah,
on." See, that's the thing is I had never heard the song before, so my
that's
initial
really
impression was
interesting.
with you, and since I never really heard you sing prior, this was like my first ever witnessed event of you singing. Listening to a song that necessarily had that, I don't know how to put it, but the lyrics and the spacing of everything had a certain way about it that in
Hmm.
traditional songwriting is not necessarily there.
Oh
So
yeah,
hearing you sing a song like this for the first time, I was like, good job. I didn't know what to expect, and then as I listened to the song, I'm like, holy crap, he did a really really good job of that.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you want to talk about Boyish then?
I mean we could. I'm sure there's a reason that that was one of the first songs, at least from this, that I happened to experience through you. So what's going on with that on your end?
I think it's one of the highlights of the album. I mean, this album for me is like great from start to finish. Um, but that song in particular, and I think it's the second most popular from that album, besides Roadhead, or after Roadhead rather. And I think it's partly in due because of the lyrics, and it was also one of the singles. And I think it's a great example of like what makes this album so great to me. It's got like the themes of like it's just romance, you know, it's sort of this longing for another person. Um Her lyricism shines through. I really like it. I think when she writes, I really appreciate her bluntness at times, but also kind of cleverness and wittiness. And sometimes her and I kind of use like that sometimes she'll use um she won't go too much with like the intensity of vocabulary, but sometimes she will. I don't think she does much on this song in particular, but in terms of like the sound, this album has produces her voice in a way. The way it's produced, her voice has this hollowness to it. Like the soundscape in which she's in, it really feels like she's alone at especially on certain points on the album. Even though there's a whole band obviously behind her, there's something to the reverb and the space that they give her vocals that really give like even if you're listening to something like 12 steps, which is like a lot more up tempo, you still have that sort of sad sound, that melancholic sound.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that really works well with what the lyrics are. My favorite line from this is "I can't get you off my mind. I can't get you off in general," which is such a like,
Oh wow.
yeah, like, and that's exactly when the first chorus starts. Um, it's such a self like deprecating, but like, I love this person or I want this person so much, and they don't want me kind of thing.
Hmm.
But it's simple, it's clever, and it works really well. And she has moments like that, especially, and especially with like this sort of grand orchestral like sound that's going when she's like behind her when she's saying that line is like oof, like this is like the arrangement of it is amazing, especially with the lyrics, like the timing and the way everything is arranged with the lyrics are perfect. Going into the chorus, you have this sort of like, you know, it's a traditional sort of songwriting technique, you know, just having tension right before the chorus.
Right.
Um, this sort of dominant chord. And she says, if you don't like how I look, then leave. And then it plays the chord progression. And that's when it lands in the chorus. But going into that, you have like these harps going on in the background and like also the drums intensify, the space opens up a lot more, and it also really the way I see the song is like a modern interpretation of like a 60s sad song, 60s sad romance song. Like I can almost hear like
Hmm.
Elvis singing some version of this. Obviously a lot more low key, but
Yeah.
but like thematically, it's like a romance song about someone someone they want, and you know, I definitely hear like influences of that sometimes, but
Yeah.
it's great.
It fits like thematically, like you were saying, about like a '60s style, like a sad romance, like you're the love of my life, but I can't have you type of deal.
Yeah.
And like if we're going back to that on Japanese Breakfast here, when it comes down to the lyricism as well as this the mood, like you were saying, the tension of the chords building, everything just building to a certain point, and then that
Mm-hmm.
release. I mean, like you were saying, it's a songwriting technique that almost every single band uses, whether they realize it or not, in almost every song. But the way
Mm-hmm.
that they do it throughout this album is it's not necessarily like waves of things. Throughout the album, it'll be at a peak and then it'll drop down have a little bit of tension build, a little something like story wise kind of build, and sit there for a
Hmm.
little bit. It makes you think and kind of sit in that emotional spectrum, like just that mood
Yeah.
it gives you. But then each song also has its own thing. If you listen to it as a song by song basis, each song is not necessarily like pull and release like on an even scape. It'll
Yeah.
build up to a point and then hit you hard all at once, and it may stay down there, but it may stay down there very shortly, come back up, and then that for the rest of the song. But that's the variety throughout the whole album, and I think they did a very fantastic job of making sure that, again, the lyrics weren't something that were overdone, but they
Yeah.
have the ability to go very far, either vocabulary or just whatever may be involved. But they applied that to every bit of the production. So the
Hmm.
drums, the keys, the effect loops, whatever is involved, each bit of it is simple at a surface level, but everything was very, very carefully thought out, and like it was methodically like this sits here a certain way and it's meant to
Yeah.
sit that way. And I
Oh
really
yeah.
enjoyed that a lot throughout the entire thing.
I think it's simplicity, though it's simple. I think the arrangement of like how everything's put together of these simple parts are just, it's like, why didn't anyone do this before kind of thing. It was like to me, like I said, I say that again, but it's like I hear this and I'm like, so crazy to me that I, maybe there is an album out there or some sort of song out there that's like really close to this, but I haven't heard something like this, and maybe I don't know if I will find something exactly like this, but yeah, definitely. And I will say the backstory behind this song is, and she said this at her live show. She's like, this song is about being a waiter, because I think this is my theory, because I know like some of the backstory, like some of her story, because I read her book. Um, she was working like at some Spanish fusion place, and that's when she had a crush on her coworker, which is now her husband and the guitarist of the band. Um, so I think that's what, when it was written. It's a very old song. It is interesting to note that like she wrote that song a long time ago, even when she was in her old project, which is she was part of a band called Little Big League, and they never got a lot of traction. Like she was touring with them, they were touring, but no one ever really liked their stuff. And you can actually hear like that version on Spotify if you find the band, and it's very different, but definitely not like this. But yeah, I think we should just like kind of like go through like the rest pretty quickly, just so like we save on time.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, pick out whichever songs you feel like stood out to you, or there's certain things that, like stand out in the rest of the album, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Right. So I talked about like how she sort of started off the album with like trying to say trying sort of to do a sci-fi thing, and then it sort of progressed to like her just being a lot more open and just talking about herself and what she went through. And a lot of her music and a lot of her art in general, including her book, is dealing with the grief about her mom dying. Um, her mom had cancer, and she took care of her and everything. She tried to obviously fight, but in the end, she ultimately didn't make it. And then towards the end of the album, you can kind of see that with "The Body Is a Blade," and I'll just read some lyrics, because once I realized what the song was about, I mean, the song already kind of hit me on an emotion level, um, but the lyrics are really, to me, I mean, when I listen back to it, it gives me goosebumps knowing exactly what it's about. Try not to get so righteous about what's right for everyone. Find what's left in you. Channel something good. Try your best to slowly withdraw from the darkest impulses of your heart. Try your best to feel and receive. Your body is a blade that cuts a path from day to day. But particularly this part um, is kind of a little more telling of what exactly she was feeling during those times. Calling it off, our hoax of trying. What's this place if you're not here? Empty the house and stage it for buying. Wave goodbye to all your things. The Body is a blade that moves while your brain is writhing. Knuckled under pain, you mourn, but your blood is flowing. So it's very, you know.
It's like poetic at certain points as well. It's
Oh
very
yeah.
literal, but it's also it gives enough of a metaphorical nudge to be like, yeah, there's a reason that these words are being combined in such a way that it's not like, okay, listen, if you do this, this happens, or this thing happens
Oh
because
yeah.
you think of
It's
this.
just it's not telling you how to feel.
Right, but it's making you aware of, like, this is all stuff everybody goes through on a day-to-day basis, the emotions, thoughts and stuff like that. Everybody's feeling so many thousands of things every day, but we pay
Mm-hmm.
attention to certain things in that day. We only
Mm-hmm.
catch so many thoughts and whatever else, right? Just like when we
Yeah.
dream, or when we sleep rather, we only sometimes pick out a certain dream here and there, although we have dozens of dreams per night.
Yeah.
There's only certain ones we may remember. So just like that, there's a lot of lyrics throughout, especially that song. I like that whole section you pointed out. Um, there's enough of just the awareness of, like, hey, bringing this to the forefront of somebody's mind. It gives them a perspective of, like, thinking on their own stuff while listening to the song.
Oh yeah. I think sometimes actually I think that's kind of a detriment to some of the lyrics on this album if you don't have the context of what actually happened. Because at least to me, it actually hit harder when I found out what the songs were about. Um, because sometimes they can, at least in my opinion, be a little too abstract. Where it's like I know you're talking about something, but I'm not like, exactly sure. Maybe that just might be, me. I'm like I couldn't interpret it or make sense of
Yeah,
it.
it takes a
But
little more digging.
yeah, I mean, one particular line that really kind of messed me up was calling it off our hoax of trying. So I just remember in the book there was a lot of guilt and a lot of mixed about her emotions that she was feeling at the time that she was taking care of her mother. Um, and that's always, like our hopes of trying was like something that she kind of felt is my theory, or at least how I interpret it with the events. And on that song in particular, there's before I'd watched the music video, I just listened to the album. For the longest time before watching the music video, I just listened to the albums. And there's a part in the middle, there's like a break, an instrumental break, where there's I think it's a synth. It's like I'm not sure how to describe it, what it does, but it's like this really cool synth sound that's like feels like a rolling wheel, so to speak. And that rolling wheel sort of moves the entire song actually from that point on. But I remember listening to that and hearing that part, and to me, like before knowing what the lyrics were, I pictured just I felt like my life was reeling, like memories. Like I felt a memory reel going through my head listening to that part, and that part always kind of like, oof, like it really gets to me. Like it still gets me goosebumps whenever I hear that part. And um, knowing what it was and actually watching the music video during that part, it's a bunch of photos of her and her mother when they were like when she was like a baby
Oh,
and stuff. And like that shit that really tears me up. um, she sang at a show in Korea that song, and then I think she turned around to see like the slideshow behind and she started crying. um so it's just, it's that whole song is just it's a simple, it's nothing like crazy, at least theoretically, but it does, what
there's a
most
lot of weight
music.
to it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
i,
weight to it.
I think it does what most art tends to do. It just, it all put together, it's really something, you know
Yeah,
even if those parts aren't exactly like advancing sort of, art or music in any sort of way, I guess, so to speak. I think they are. But
yeah. I mean, it was something along the lines of, I can't remember who it came from or what it came from, but there was something along the lines of, art is always the most compelling in its purest form, meaning like it's in its
yeah.
simplest form, in its most complete idea. It doesn't need to
Mm-hmm.
be complicated. It doesn't need to be complex. It doesn't need to always change up the game. But the
Yeah.
purest to whatever it is that you know, art is an expression in its simplest form. So through the lyrics and the soundscapes that they make through this song in particular, they're able to really convey something very visceral, at least to
Yeah.
her. Um, and again, it doesn't need to be stupid complicated. Um, a lot of simple songs. That's why a lot of guitar chords, a lot of very simple, very melodic guitar chords.
Yeah.
I've seen this a lot, and even for me, it's the same case. Is people can, at the sound of a certain chord or a certain progression or a certain guitar lick, just that the melodic capacity it takes is there's an emotion tied to that, or there's something in our brain that's wired to, like, I don't know how else to describe this, but the Neil Morse band on their album The Similitude of a Dream, there's a melody that's played at the beginning of the album that thematically represents itself again and again in different ways. They may change the key, they may change the way it's put in, but the way the initial melody is played and the way it's played at the end of the album, it makes me cry like a baby. And
Hmm.
it ties in the entire idea of the album, but it's something super super simple. Like, it's a very simple progression. There's, I mean, you could
Right.
probably learn it on the spot. It's nothing stupid complicated, but stuff like that, certain people hear, just like I'm sure in parts of this album, there are certain things that weigh heavier in your chest than most other music.
Yeah. It's filled. It's very complete. Even though
Yes,
it's simple, it's a complete
it's very
song.
dense. It's very dense.
Yeah.
The whole album's very dense, but there's certain songs in particular, like you're pointing out, that just have a little bit more to them.
Yeah. And okay, then there's just the last two songs that I do just want to talk about. Till Death, and I haven't been talking about this much, but like some of the bass lines on this album are phenomenal. But Till Death in particular, she actually did this on her recent album Jubilee. Her beat drops, like when the band actually joins in, particularly the rhythm section actually kicks in, she is really good at doing that sometimes. And this song Till Death, and also another song off the newer album, man, does it hit. Like, it's a song it's a song about her husband.
Mm-hmm.
um it's really really, this to me it's another one there, it's like the lyrics really really shine through. And actually, I might even say, like, from a songwriting perspective, it might be, like, in my opinion, the best song off the album.
Really?
It might compete with that, with Boyish. I don't think it has as much going on, obviously, with stuff like Machinist or Roadhead. Those have different strengths, but to me, like, Till Death showcases what makes her, like, a really good artist. Like, what, at least to me, is make, like, her strongest points really come out here.
Gotcha.
The arrangement of the song, like I said, it starts off with just a little piano, and then the bass kicks in while she's singing along. But then there's a pause, sort of, where the melody's sort of at a lull, and then the beat drops. But the line that sort of the band kind of kicks off in after she lulls is "Your shape in the dark." So it's just like, sort of, a lot of tension build up, lull, and then the entire band joins in, kicks in into this really soft sort of like hug, is like how I like to call it, or what that feels like to me. These really sort of I think they're like EP pianos, electronic pianos, that make sort of this, have a really warm sound to them, and they really fit with the themes. I just want to say, like, the lyrics about of them. All our celebrities keep dying, while the cruel men continue to win. You reassure me in a way you only can. Got these days to go by like the swaying of a ship. And then the beat drops. Your shape in the dark. Out of state, licensed to me. Public pool, Miller Moon. Um, don't turn away. I'm still awake. And then steeping on hostile waves of panic, like fighting a wheel that pulls to the right. I don't deserve you, but I'm giving it my best. Extol your sacrifice with fine caviars and aspics. Your voice in the night, sing me to sleep, soothe this insomnia. Haunted dreams, stages of grief, repressed memories, anger and bargaining. Your embrace, healing my wounds, teach me to breathe, teach me to move. PTSD, anxiety, genetic disease, thanatophobia. Um, yeah,
It's a lot to go over in one sitting, but
there is. Majority of this is really just like sort of just saying like how it feels and like how she feels about him and stuff. But I think towards the end, she's essentially talking about like the things that she went through with him, which is you know, PTSD, anxiety, and stuff like that. I guess seems like to me, from what I know, the context of like what actually she went through with her mother, he was there throughout all of that, and genetic disease, obviously cancer,
yeah.
um, and he was there throughout all that, um, and in there's a really cool key change. It goes up, I think, a whole or a half step the entire song. It does this really cool key change where it goes like minor chord and then just goes right back into like this really open major sound, and you have these lush, very very lush, like blooming sounds of saxophones that come in after the key change, and you're
Oh
like,
yeah, I know which part you're talking about.
ooh. And even before then, there's like a buildup of these horns, like sort of building up triumphantly. Like it's a really big swell, and then like the bass line is so melodic, and it moves the song. Like it's a fairly simple progression that sort of loops, but the way it's arranged, it's like another like strong sort of thing that something that her band is really good at. Um, doing, and it really showcases in that song. And man, does it pull my heartstrings? That song, oh man, it's so beautiful. It's just such a beautiful song, and I think it's one of her best vocal performances, truthfully. Also, thanatophobia is the fear of death. That's the last line. Um, but yeah,
Is there anything else you want to close out with on the album here?
that's all I have to say about. I mean, there's a lot more, but that's all I
Yeah.
would say to save on time.